Hello everybody, my name is Fortefyre and welcome to the second installment of the Ready Go Gaming Show. Today we're going to be talking about RPGs. Now RPGs are a little bit different because I never really played them growing up. I know it sounds stupid, but for me I was more of an action-adventure kind of fan. But as I got older and as I grew to appreciate the intricacies of games, I started liking RPGs. So that's what this episode is going to be all about, RPGs. I'm sorry if you hear my daughter in the background, she's not feeling well. And speaking of not feeling well, I just got over a huge episode of food poisoning it really put me down for the count. I was drinking water and watching other people on Twitch. I couldn't even stream, which really sucked because I lost a good weekend of streaming. But, you know, when push comes to shove, I need to take care of myself before I can do fun stuff like this. So unlike the first episode, I actually have 3 guest speakers speaking on this video. The first one is Babyfyre because she can't seem to stop crying. She doesn't feel well. We all know this. The second person is Bag of Tricks, who advertises himself as an elite casual gamer. He usually streams in the mornings, I want to say, but he plays a variety of games from retro all the way to new stuff. Don't push the mute button. And the other guy that's on the video is Blurgarian. Blurgarian is a Canadian streamer who kind of plays whatever the hell he feels like it, but he's really entertaining and you should totally check him out. Both of their Twitches are going to be down in the description below, so definitely give them a like and a follow if you get a chance. They're really awesome. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and talk about some RPGs. Ah, that hurts. When you think of RPGs, you likely attribute your love to the genre based on the titles that you played as a kid, such as Dragon Age, Kingdom Hearts, Final Fantasy, Chrono Trigger, or maybe even Secret of Mana. But when you think of the genre, it's easy to blanket your opinion based on the games themselves. The true reason why RPGs stand out is the experience that it creates. The keyword here is experience. The experience individuals had playing RPGs ultimately defined their perspective on the genre, whether it was positive or negative. But let's dissect the genre and look and see why they are so memorable. The first major part of a successful RPG is the storyline. The storyline or campaign is the lifeblood of the genre, and in older times was the job of a collective group of people to create, and a dungeon master or a game master to control. The purpose of this individual was to make sure that the game flow was kept active, and also that the story was engaging, to create the aura that you truly were in a separate time and place, fighting monsters and developing the characters that individuals built from the ground up. Additionally, storyline control was an interesting aspect as well. The characters in the campaign, even in a contemporary sense, had the ability to freely explore and do whatever they wanted. This freedom of choice was a refreshing aspect of the genre and was usually facilitated using die of an indiscriminate number. I've seen them exceed 20, but 20 is the traditional norm. However, the most important aspect, hands down, of RPGs across the board was the creation of your character. In other genres, you simply assume a role. You have to complete that role fighting monsters or achieving objectives, getting from point A to B in a linear fashion. RPGs enabled individuals to physically invest time and patience into creating their character and watching them grow in front of them, grinding for experience and the best gear to get the job done. With different levels would come increased stats necessary to take on the various events and enemies that would come the adventurer's way. RPGs have their earliest roots in war games and tabletop games, the capacity of which was traditionally limited to moving pawns or other pieces. Some of the earliest examples of this were games such as chess, which is based on an even earlier game by the name of Chaturanga in India. This game would inspire many regional games such as shogi, jungi, and situyen. These games evolved over a significant amount of time, and eventually there was a want to create something different, something where pieces were assigned roles outside of simply moving in a certain direction. This was obtained in 1971 with the release of Chainmail, a medieval miniature war game created by Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin. Inspired by Tolkien works, Chainmail would be the inspiration for the OG tabletop RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D, was a key entry in the world of RPGs because it allowed for in-depth creation of characters of various races and armor classes. Since its creation, it's expanded massively to 5 different editions, each with their own unique additions to the baseline game. This game series has a massive following, creating an entire subculture in gaming that thrives to this day. In fact, the 70s as a decade was a breeding ground for the genre and tabletop gaming as a whole, leading to the success of other games like Empire of the Petal Throne, Traveler, GURPS, as well as Champion. While the variance is still popular, the emergence of RPG video games and collectible card games impacted the industry heavily as people, as a dynamic, shifted towards progress.
Dungeons & Dragons was the go-to source material for many other games as we mentioned before. The concept of character creation, class management, storyline advancement, and the events that occurred naturally over the time of the campaign allowed for the opportunity for a jump to the new age of gaming, the video game. RPGs first started on mainframe computers as small projects made by people as a new way to play their favorite tabletop games. Games such as Dungeon, Petit 5, and D&D from the 70s allowed for a different perspective of the genre people were so much in love with. However, in 1979, a game by the name of Temple of Asphi advertised as a world of monsters and magic entered the fray and was incredibly successful, selling 20,000 copies in 1981 and 30,000 copies in 1982, maintaining the hype and energy to this day from its conception. Because of the success of the game, add-ons were created, paving the way for Aklabeth World of Doom. Aklabeth was created by Richard Garriott for the Apple II as a hobby project inspired by Dungeons & Dragons. It was sold in Ziploc bags for a low price of $5. When it was commercially picked up, the price was $35, and young Garriott would end up selling 30,000 copies, amassing $150,000 in sales. This heavily inspired Garriott to continue making more games, expanding on the formula that was successful in his previous endeavor. The game he would create next would be a staple of the RPG world, known only as Ultima. Ultima is a landmark title in the genre that has released 9 different games. The first, Ultima 1, The First Age of Darkness, was one of the first commercially available computer RPGs that had a top-down, third-person view that also allowed for dungeons to take place in a first-person perspective. Additionally, in contrast to previous tabletop RPGs, Ultima 1 featured a point distribution system for created characters. 4 races were offered: human, elf, dwarf, and bobbit. You can kinda figure out where that last one came from. And 4 classes offered: Fighter, Cleric, Wizard, and Thief. Additionally, gender could be chosen as well. The game featured hit points, food, experience points, and coins, also known as gold. While Ultima was a phenomenal series, it was by no means the only RPG series to be born from 70s RPGs, as another key franchise by the name of Wizardry was starting its lifespan. Much like Ultima, Wizardry began as a project game on the Apple II by Andrew Greenberg, who interestingly enough saw Ultima as a major competitor and refused to package his game in Ziploc bags like Garriott on the advice of one of his investors. Over the years, Wizardry would release 8 titles, with the most recent being in 2001. Over the course of the 80s, RPGs would begin to evolve in programming and aesthetics, and the simple ASCII art many were used to would turn into vibrant colors and phenomenal enemies. Franchises like Might and Magic, Wizard's Crown, The Bard's Tale, and even Wasteland, the spiritual forefather of the Fallout series, would enter the arena, ushering it into a new generation of gamers.
Every living being is an engine geared to the wheelwork of the universe. Though seemingly affected only by its immediate surrounding, the sphere of influence extends to infinite distance. This is a quote made by Nikola Tesla, and it's incredibly true. The RPG genre was so successful in America that it was only a matter of time before its sphere of influence exited its boundaries and grew roots in other parts of the world. These roots planted themselves firmly in Japan, courtesy of Wizardry, where developers wanted to make their own variants of the genre but had some issues. First and foremost, Japanese characters were very difficult to program on an aspect ratio for Japanese computers. This proved to be a momentary inconvenience, as in 1982, Koei was able to release several games, such as Underground Exploration, The Dragon and the Princess for the PC-8001, and Pony Canyon's Spy Daisaksen. This game featured a twist on the traditional fantasy mantra and instead consisted of espionage, a sort of Mission Impossible homage, if you will. One RPG in particular, Bokusaka Wars, was originally released on the Sharp X1 computer and later ported to the NES in 1985. This game established the framework for the tactical RPG subgenre, also known as the simulation RPG in Japan. But the first commercial console RPG was Dragon Stomper on the Atari 2600. Over the course of time, Japanese developers would continue to experiment with programming and perfecting the formula that would be known as the Japanese RPG, or JRPG for short. In the early 80s, a company by the name of Enix held a contest for video game programmers to see what sort of potential they might have on their teams. Yuji Hiyori was one of the winners and was able to take a trip to the 1983 Apple Fest in San Francisco, where he immediately fell in love with Wizardry. The 2 other winners, Koichi Nakamura and Yokunu Mochida worked alongside Hiyori to create a game known as the Protopia Serial Murder Case. A totally separate person who was also known for making pop jingles idolized the game and actively pursued Enix to be part of future developments. Needless to say, Enix approved. So, you might be wondering, where does this all tie in? Well, being inspired by wizardry, Hiyori desired to develop his own RPG with the intent to take the full world map style of Ultima and combine it with the statistic-driven nature of wizardry, giving birth to the game that you know as Dragon Quest. Hiyori even asked for help from a close friend of his, you might know him by the way, Akira Toriyama, who at the time was known for the Dragon Ball manga, to do the artwork for the game. The project came to life in 1985 with the release of Dragon Quest in Japan, while the localized version was called Dragon Warrior in the United States to avoid copyright issues. Around the same time, another company by the name of Squaresoft was falling deep into debt and on the brink of bankruptcy. For the most part, the company was known for making games that covered many genres such as the text-based adventure The Death Trap, racing games like Rad Racer, and run-and-gun games such as Thexter, and the 3D battles of World Runner. In fact, the previous game was made by a team of 3 critical members, Nasir Gabili, Hironobu Sakaguchi, and Nobuo Uematsu. Hironobu in particular took note of the RPG craze in America and pitched the idea of a JRPG to Square. They, however, shut him down instantaneously, claiming that the genre would fade out and not sell well to Japanese consumers. However, upon the release and success of Dragon Quest, Square reconsidered their stance and allowed Sakaguchi to create an RPG with the initials of FF. The story traditionally goes that this game was meant to be the final game for Square, leading to the landmark title in 1987 known as Final Fantasy. Over the course of time, many elements of the JRPG would continue to evolve, such as grinding for XP, beautiful world design, deep and convoluted stories that have segments and side quests. The iconic titles such as Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and Phantasy Star Online would serve as a solid platform for all future endeavors concerning JRPGs. It's because of these titles that the subgenre remains as strong as ever today.
By the time the 90s rolled around, tabletop RPGs were still active and growing, but slowly declining courtesy of video game RPGs, which allowed for the story to be played without the aid of a game master. Card games would also put pressure on the tabletop RPG brand, thanks to Magic the Gathering, which was released in 1993 by way of Peter Adkison and Richard Garfield. By now, RPGs were not as harsh on the eyes as they were in the 80s, and in the 90s, gamers were introduced to concepts that revolved around isometric views and well-defined sprites. Wizardry and Ultima were still heavy contenders, but a software development company by the name of Sierra Entertainment, which was already known for point-and-click adventures, entered the fray with the 1992 release of Quest for Glory. It included stories, complex puzzles, as well as arcade-styled combat. The series went headstrong up until 1998. However, a game in 1993 called Legends of Valor by Synthetic Dimensions was created for computers and was one of the first RPG games to use a continuously scrolling 3D environment engine much like Wolfenstein 3D. Using a point-and-click interface, real-time combat, as well as time cycles, the game was relatively advanced for its time. Players could be wounded, NPCs would behave to overhearing conversations, and diseases could be caught. However, despite the technological advances, the game was not received well, but had a lot of issues, bugs plagued the game, and only the Amiga version was praised despite the fact the game was released on multiple platforms. The game was played by Todd Howard, who took inspiration for it while working at Bethesda Softworks, and incorporated themes from the game, as well as Ultima Underworld to create their own brand of games piggybacking on the mechanics present in the previous game. This game series would be known as the Elder Scrolls. But unfortunately, as stated earlier, the genre started to decline and a new branch of RPGs would arise from the ashes known as action RPGs. Diablo was the standard for action RPGs at the time, inspiring future game titles such as Fate, Sacred, and even Din's Curse. Additionally, in the 80s, another well-known RPG series known as Fallout was released. It wasn't known as Fallout in the beginning. Instead, it was known as Wasteland. Much like Diablo, it shared an isometric view, expansive storylines, and a sort of tongue-in-cheek humor. At the same time, Dungeons & Dragons was successfully revitalizing their brand by releasing many games that were related to campaigns inside the game, such as arcade beat-em-ups Tower of Doom and Shadow over Mystara, which followed the Mystara campaign. In the later years of the 90s, RPGs would again see a decline, much like the early 90s, with the creation of MMORPGs as an online variant that would allow for people to interact in a virtual world.
In the 90s, the JRPG would experience a sort of golden age, where platforms such as the Super NES received groundbreaking titles that many people hold near and dear to their hearts. One of the first JRPGs of the 90s, Dragon Quest IV, had segmented storylines to allow for a more immersive gameplay experience, as opposed to the earlier JRPGs that had linear objectives and storytelling style. Nintendo would even enter the fray with the Fire Emblem series, further boosting the concept of the tactical RPG. Other early RPGs included Koei's Bandit Kings of China, Nobunaga's Ambition, and the iconic Megami Tensei. In 1991, one of the most important JRPGs was Final Fantasy IV. It was localized in America as Final Fantasy II and bridged the gap to the 16-bit console by introducing the active time battle system that allowed for an attack gauge to fill up in real time. Square and Enix would lead the pack with their continued endeavors, with Square's Final Fantasy V and Enix's Dragon Quest V. This battle between companies would last for years, with heavy-hitting titles including Saga and The Secret of Mana. However, towards the middle of the 90s, Square would shock the world with the release of Chrono Trigger, which set the framework for all Eastern RPGs in the mid-90s. The game featured non-linear gameplay, a branching plot, and more than a dozen endings depending upon how the player played. Additionally, a new concept called New Game Plus was created, although The Legend of Zelda already offered this with its second quest. With New Game Plus, replayability was born. Historically, Chrono Trigger was one of the greatest games ever created, and Enix's answer to that was Dragon Quest VI, which was soon supplemented with the release of Star Ocean in 1996. Eventually, the PlayStation was released, offering companies a shot at upping their standards even more than before, with enhanced graphical capabilities and a medium that could hold significantly more data. And boy did they ever use it. In 1997, the release of Final Fantasy VII was released on 4 separate discs. Final Fantasy VII was a heavy hitter considered to be one of the best, if not the best, Final Fantasy game of all time. Other critically acclaimed Eastern releases during the 90s would also include Xenogears, Suikoden 2, and Chrono Cross.
After the 2000s, the genre ultimately began its slow decline as players began seeing the tropes of RPGs that made them so popular in the 90s not as popular anymore. Many loyal fans to many of the series that were so popular remain loyal, but a new generation of gamers took a liking to different styles of gaming, as so many were coming out. New players faced music games, action-adventure games, and the Japanese gaming industry was losing to the Western Front, which was releasing new and improved titles such as Fable, Mass Effect, and Fallout. In fact, a vast majority of 2000s era RPGs were more popular in the handheld spectrum. In the Western Front, game series like those mentioned before rekindled the interest in the genre, with games such as Neverwinter Nights, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, Fallout, and Elder Scrolls in particular standing out amongst the competition. Speaking of Elder Scrolls, Bethesda, who had released Elder Scrolls Arena in 1994, continued making heavy-hitting titles since the first release. Daggerfall in particular was well received, as being a flawed masterpiece with almost endless degrees of play and a massive amount of quests and adventures to boot. Winning many awards, it set a public interest for more games of this style, and when there is a demand, there is bound to be a supply. In 2002, the third entry in the series, Morrowind, was released and won many awards due to it being a contemporary title with appealing graphics and the framework of the previous games, although in a more refined and playable setting. Expansions would be created, and eventually Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion would come out, paving the way for the most successful Elder Scrolls game in the series, Skyrim, in 2011. Outside of that, Fallout would continue to be a household name, and indie companies would start staking their claim in the new generation by introducing titles such as Depths of Peril, The Witcher, and Stalker Shadow Chernobyl. Another thing to consider is that in 2002, the world was rocked by the merger of two heavy-hitting companies that kicked off the JRPG craze, Square and Enix, who would go on to form Square Enix to release many more heavy-hitting titles and acquiring more companies that were known in the gaming community, such as Eidos, renaming them to Square Enix Europe, as well as Taito, the company known for Bubble Bobble. Well, I guess it's that time that we talk about franchises. Please note that this list is not an all-inclusive list. The games mentioned in this section primarily consist of games that made companies stand out, or even consoles stand out. Games considered to be the greatest of all time, well, you kinda get the gist of it. So that being said, your favorite RPG might not be on this list, but don't worry, they have a great chance of being included in another video.
Baldur's Gate. We've touched a little bit on Baldur's Gate, but I happen to love this game, so I feel it needs to be talked about a little more. BioWare was able to renew hope in the D&D community by offering players a refreshing and different take on the series that had its success deeply rooted in the pen and paper era of RPGs. Baldur's Gate, without a doubt, set the standard for computer-based RPGs, and had a top-down perspective, which was the norm for the time, but it was a norm that many other successful RPGs would follow, such as Diablo and Fallout. The game was set deep in the lore of D&D, and even had storytelling elements, plus it was made by a Canadian developer, so it's already going to be awesome. The game saw 3 expansions that increased the replayability of the game, and in 2000 a sequel was made called Baldur's Gate 2. It was an award-winning game that kept the formula of the first installment and to date has sold over 2 million copies. It has also spawned the Dark Alliance sub-series, which was successful in its own endeavors.
The Bard's Tale. The Bard's Tale is definitely an old game, but it's a good game. It was a heavily successful one that was created during the hype of RPGs in the 80s. It sold 407,000 copies the year it was released and was loved by many because it was a direct competitor with Ultima and Wizardry, who both were leading the industry at the time. As a dungeon crawler, it did however fail to appease the community as the genre crossed over into the 90s with the new expectations of the time. Despite 6 more releases, the hype simply wasn't matched. However, there is a new Bard's Tale in works using the Unreal Engine 4, so fingers crossed that it can come back and take the world by storm in a contemporary environment that's not really impressed by the older styles.
The Chrono series, more specifically Chrono Trigger, was known as the crowning jewel of JRPGs on the Super NES. Shared by Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, the game featured branching storylines, multiple endings, and a beautiful soundtrack. It sold millions of copies and is a captivating game that remains in the memories of many gamers. Its sequel, Chrono Cross, was also met with critical acclaim, featuring a storyline with parallel dimensions, allowing players to enjoy the game over and over again in a multitude of ways. Much like its predecessor, it featured no random encounters, which was a trope that was prevalent in many RPGs in Japan and the United States. Despite cries from fans around the world, no more Chrono games have been made. While it's an unfortunate truth, our childhood memories of this series will remain until the day of Lavos.
Dragon Age. Dragon Age is probably one of the first RPGs I ever played growing up, and that was solely because I worked at EA and we had discounts, so I figured why not. BioWare was a household name in the 90s due to its success with the Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights series, and had dabbled in making games where individuals could make choices, a trope that pulled in a lot of gamers who praised the concept. The first actual step towards this kind of game was Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic and then Jade Empire, but Mass Effect set the standard. Keeping this formula and changing the elements to reflect a medieval theme, Dragon Age was released in 2009. It received many expansions and DLCs that were loved by critics and fans alike. Many people enjoyed something that BioWare was notorious for, and that involved the usage of many companions that the player could choose to fit certain situations. The game received a sequel in 2011, but it just couldn't hold a candle to the first release. But that didn't stop BioWare, who with the blessing and financial prowess of Electronic Arts released Dragon Age Inquisition. Inquisition was the call to arms for many gamers, and critics claimed that BioWare answered the prayers for gamers.
Dragon Warrior. Oftentimes considered to be the first major JRPG, Enix created Dragon Warrior in 1986, gathering concepts from well-known RPGs such as Ultima and Wizardry, who were leading the industry in the United States, but we already covered that. Dragon Warrior, known as Quest for the first few American releases,
strike that, reverse it. This way, please!
Was responsible for launching the JRPG craze, and without it, Final Fantasy likely would never have been created. However, we didn't cover an important fact of the game, and that was that in the beginning, it was not popular at all. The reason why Dragon Warrior gained so much traction in the community was courtesy of articles posted to Shonen Jump. Akira Toriyama was already well known for his artwork in the manga Dragon Ball, so his blessing was well received. The next release was also equally as successful and featured the ability for the player to control multiple characters, and expanded heavily on the previous entry. The game featured more spells and also had a game of chance in it, allowing the character to try their luck in the lottery. The game was planned to be a trilogy, so the release of Dragon Warrior 3 completed that requirement and again expanded heavily on the previous two games. With Dragon Warrior 4, the series hit that would often be considered the peak of the game's popularity, selling 1.2 million copies. The entire main series spawned 11 main series games and 12 spin-off games, with 3 separate series that parallel the universe.
EVE Online. We can't talk about MMORPGs and leave out one of the most influential space games of all time. EVE was historically one of the most successful MMORPGs with its release in 2003 by CCP Games. The game featured economic elements that were vastly different from other MMORPGs to include warfare elements and a frontier that more often than not is ignored: outer space. EVE is still going strong and doesn't show any signs of wavering as consumers continue to explore the galaxy, of which has 7,800 star systems to check out. EverQuest. EverQuest is also an MMORPG, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game that started in 1999. It's often considered to be one of the entry-level MMORPGs that contributed to the downfall of the home console RPG. It heavily impacted the market, and even with a subscription service, saw a massive participation by gamers of all ages. Since its birth, it sparked 24 expansions, each providing their own unique addition to the gameplay experience.
Fable. Fable came out of left field in 2004 and was praised due to the freedom of choice that a player would have in making decisions. If players chose to be kind, heroic, and honorable, their alignment would reflect that, while if they chose to be cruel, merciless, and hostile, their alignment would tarnish and NPCs would recognize that. The first game was a success, but the second release was critically acclaimed with 790,000 copies sold during the initial release and over 3.5 million copies over the lifespan of its release. Even PETA liked the game. No, seriously, they loved it, and it's considered to be the best-selling RPG on the Xbox 360. Unfortunately, like many games, the third didn't live up to the hype and was felt as a disappointment for many players.
Before Fallout, there was a game by the name of Wasteland. It was a grotesque adventure taking place during a global nuclear war that pitted a surviving group of army rangers against various monsters and entities in a post-apocalyptic setting. For 1988, the game was successful, prompting a sequel by the name of Fountain of Dreams by Electronic Arts. The sequel was a commercial failure, and the people despised the game due to the fact that it was significantly shorter than Wasteland. To recuperate from this disaster, the game was retconned to not be part of the series. Interplay wanted to make a second game to cover up EA's failure. The game would have been related to Wasteland and called Meantime. Meantime would have brought together a large number of people from the Wasteland development team. But by the time the project was brought together into development stages, the Apple II computer that it was going to be designed for had started declining in sales, killing the project altogether. But that didn't stop Interplay from trying to recreate the magic of Wasteland for audiences that demanded RPGs, and thus Fallout was born. In its design and purpose, it was meant to be a direct sequel to Wasteland, but the rights couldn't be obtained for the Wasteland series, so the game itself was made into a separate series, making Fallout the spiritual successor to Wasteland. Wasteland 2 would be released far into the future, but in 1994, Fallout was already taking the markets by storm with its grimy, in-your-face, Plub magazine-style gameplay, utilizing a system called Special. The game was a success and led to the creation of Fallout 2 in 1998. It's mentioned often because emphasis needs to be placed on how many RPGs couldn't bridge the gap into the late 90s contemporary setting. Fallout was the exception. The artwork was phenomenal, and its voice acting was on par with games of the time. The only downfall of the game was the sheer number of bugs and the lack of improvement from the first game. It, however, was commercially successful with over 123,000 copies sold by the end of May in 2000. As a company, Interplay was experiencing severe financial issues. To avoid going into bankruptcy, shares were sold, which temporarily removed them from that sliding slope. However, the damage had already been done. Interplay Entertainment Corporation needed investors to supplement their company. And, to that effect, they turned to Titus Software, who gladly invested in their company. However, Titus itself went bankrupt in 2005, placing Interplay in bankruptcy spotlight yet again. Its shares were purchased by Bethesda in 2007 for the low price of $1,175,000. Bethesda was already well known in the RPG world courtesy of their take on the RPG genre. The Elder Scrolls series and the people at Bethesda felt confident that they could rework Fallout into a game series that would be memorable and enjoyable for its consumers. This led to the development of Fallout 3. A game that received universal acclaim as being a totally different RPG that incorporated numerous different mechanics that were not in previous games. However, for the individuals who loved the previous style of Fallout and its isometric view, they were not fans. Despite the opposition, it still sold 4.7 units worldwide, showing a clear metric that people wanted another game in the series. This would lead to Bethesda reaching out to Obsidian Entertainment to develop Fallout New Vegas. Despite the game being riddled with game-ending bugs and crashes, it still sold 11.6 million copies and is considered to be commercially successful. Most recently, Fallout 4 was released to critical acclaim and featured a world chock full of exploration and an atmosphere that customers fell in love with. Final Fantasy. Now, we've already covered this, but for those of you who are curious, let's take a look at them. The first game in the series was Final Fantasy I, which was created due to the commercial success of Enix's Dragon Quest series. The first game served as a genuine competitor to Dragon Quest and is often considered to be the go-to RPG on the NES during its lifespan. One key component to the Final Fantasy series is that each individual game saw a different addition of mechanics that made the game so successful. The first game featured classes and a linear storyline, but the sequel had named characters that went on an adventure on a predetermined path. It was an experience-based combat system assigned to how the player played the game. For example, more damage taken could potentially result in health increase, while more damage issued could result in an increased damage number. This was a departure from many JRPGs at the time that solely depended upon the experience gained by killing monsters and using that experience to enhance all aspects of the characters. The next game, Final Fantasy III, was released in Japan. Oh yeah, I totally forgot to mention that Final Fantasy II and III were released exclusively in Japan, mainly in part to the fact that American consumers were receiving games much later than Japanese consumers. Final Fantasy III was a different game altogether than its predecessor as well, with characters able to change their classes at any times. The combination seemed endless and the game was considered difficult, but hey, don't let that sway you from trying it. Piggybacking on the success of previous games, Final Fantasy IV was released in 1991. This time, American consumers were able to play the game, although it was localized as Final Fantasy II, which confused many gamers who believed it was going to be a sequel to Final Fantasy I. New mechanics included the active battle system, which allowed for a refreshing way to play JRPG games. The next game in the series would be Final Fantasy V, again, a Japanese exclusive, but the story was considered weak when compared to the other games. However, Square would fix that with the release of Final Fantasy VI, also known as Final Fantasy III in the United States. 6 is considered to be one of the greatest Final Fantasy games of all time. Many games in the series were popular on a massive scale, and even the remakes of older games maintained the same spirit that the earlier games had. Although some of them were looked down upon though for their cheap-looking 3D graphics. But that's a different discussion for a different day. Square would continue to release amazing titles such as Final Fantasy VII, another greatest game of all time contender that even spawned movies. All in all, The series has had 15 main titles with 4 spin-off series and a vast number of collections.
Front Mission. Front Mission was a departure from the traditional formula that was making Square so popular. The first game in 2000 featured an isometric view, which I'm not a big fan of, but 500,000 copies sold in Japan during its release shows that clearly other people were into the series. The series featured mechs and a tactical edge that made this series unique. With the release of Front Mission 2, the success was repeated with 496,200 copies sold during its release. However, the game was plagued with long loading times, the unfortunate reality when it came to games released during the time. Front Mission 3 was the next release in the series, and is possibly one of the most well-known Front Mission titles as it departed from the formula that was so popular. In this release, Square implemented heavy focus towards role-playing elements. Despite being so popular, it only sold 298,342 copies the year it was released. As the series continued on, it would decline in popularity, as 4 released only 169,606 copies the year it was released, which is shocking because it was the first Front Mission created after the Square Enix merger. After 4, the series was unfortunately dead, and in recent years was made into a mobile phone game. Nintendo's attempt at RPGs was typically limited in scope, with Super Mario RPG being the one that everyone knows. But in the handheld market, Nintendo created a series named Golden Sun, which is oftentimes considered to be the greatest series of handheld RPGs. There's only been 3, so check them out if you get the chance. Grandia. Grandia stood out as an RPG that was prevalent on systems that unfortunately didn't make the grade against their competitors. Yes, we are talking about the late-gen Sega's consoles. Grandia 1 was however released on the PS1, but the initial release occurred on the Sega Saturn. In fact, many of the elements that made this game series work were due in part to the Lunar series, where Takeshi Miyagi made a name for himself. The first release was massively successful and is considered a must-have for Saturn collectors. The sequel, Grandia 2, was a commercial success on the Sega Dreamcast as well, and has a super unique battle system that has some limited movement while fighting the enemy. The third entry suffered the fate of many third game releases, and was not nearly as successful, but still a popular game in its own right.
Illusion of Gaia is a one-off game that many people enjoyed on the Super NES. It sold over 200,000 copies in Japan and a whopping 300,000 copies in North America. It was filled with unique puzzles, elite graphics, and a difficulty range that people could get used to. If you enjoyed games that maintained the general framework of a JRPG without the difficulty but had a more relaxing environment, then this is definitely worth checking out. Kingdom Hearts is an unforgettable gem for any child growing up in the early 2000s. In this game, Square Enix would take popular characters from their Final Fantasy series and cross them over with Disney to create a storytelling adventure like no other. To be honest though, I don't exactly remember all of the story, and that makes me a bit sad, but I'll never forget the feeling of sheer wonderment that this game inspired. The first release was a commercial success, and many consider it to be one of the greatest games of the PS2 era. The sequel was equally successful, but featured a different perspective and an even more confusing storyline, while still capturing the magic of the first game. But then, out of nowhere, Square Enix decided to make the choice to move the series to other platforms such as cell phones, DS, and the PSP. These titles were not as successful as their previous games, and the series has been on significant hiatus since then. But recently, there have been previews for the long-awaited Kingdom Hearts 3. Lufia was a well-known series that began on the Super Nintendo in 1993 with the release of Lufia and the Fortress of Doom. It's a very traditionally styled RPG that operates on a 2D plane, subjecting players to incredibly different dungeons with random encounters along the way. The game, however, was plagued by the same error that occurred in Final Fantasy I's gameplay. If multiple characters attacked an enemy and the enemy was defeated, the player would be forced to miss their attack. An unfortunate flaw in the programming. It may have competed with Super Mario RPG during its release, but all in all, with 4 releases, it wasn't a bad series.
Lunar. The Lunar series is well known mainly in part to it being created solely for the Sega CD. It was a heavy-hitting RPG for the console edition to the Genesis and Mega Drive, and is a game series that is often looked for by game collectors. The game made the maximum use of the Sega CD's capabilities and was the second highest Mega CD title of the time. The sequel, Eternal Blue, was also as successful, with it being still an installment on the Sega CD. The game, featuring the breaking of the fourth wall, something RPGs tended not to do, and also featured pop culture references, another thing vastly avoided by RPGs. Overall, the series saw 4 releases, with the series mitigating to the failed Saturn and with the most recent release being a Nintendo DS game.
Mass Effect is an RPG that follows more of an action RPG sort of track, but is critically acclaimed as a series due to its innovative plot, number of significant quests, and conversation options that mainly circled around an interactive storyline. Mass Effect 2 continued the story and completely reworked the concept of space exploration, bringing back some series regulars depending upon decisions made in the previous game. At this time, BioWare decided that the story should be told over the course of a trilogy, and Mass Effect 3 was released in 2012. It was released to critical acclaim, but the ending of the game caused significant backlash in the community. In response to this, BioWare created DLC and an extended cut to allow the story to end in a way that consumers felt that it should. In 2017, Mass Effect Andromeda was released, housing a separate storyline from the original and using the new Frostbite 3 engine. However, this game failed to garner the same response that the original trilogy of games did. Megami Tensei was Atlus's entry into the RPG world, which was based heavily in science fiction elements revolving around high school students. It was a Japanese exclusive game involving heavy storylines that were heavily inspired by wizardry. One unique aspect of the game was that it was developed in different formats depending upon which medium you used to play it. For example, the Famicom players experienced a more traditional role-playing experience that had first-person perspectives, whereas the PC version was a top-down dungeon crawler where battles took place in real time. The game would receive a sequel in 1995, and it would be just as successful as the previous game. Again, elements of the occult, science fiction, and post-apocalyptic environments were still present. From this point onward, Atlus would focus on a series by the name of Shin Megami Tensei, which would release 9 different titles. But the Megami Tensei series is more known for spinning off an entirely different series, that one by the name of Persona. Persona was a massively successful series that retained many of the elements from the older Megami Tensei games while still introducing contemporary aspects of gaming at the time. Overall, 5 games were released with 4 spin-offs. Talk about a spin-offception.
Ni no Kuni series. Introduced in 2011, this series was widely anticipated before it was even created because the concept was one that was refreshing, and the promotions that came out with it was definitely appealing. The story is a role-playing game that is sort of linear but does have open-world elements to it. The design and gameplay was loved by gamers, and the game sold over 1 million units over the course of its lifespan. One of the reasons that the game was so successful is because it was animated by Studio Ghibli, the same studio that brought us titles like Spirited Away, Kiki's Delivery Service, and a bunch of other beautiful anime movies that have been released since 1986. A sequel was released and was embraced just as much as the first game. Phantasy Star. Phantasy Star was Sega's entry into the foray of JRPGs and followed a sort of dungeon crawler-esque feel that was popular in the late 80s. However, what was different is that the game had fantastic music courtesy of the FM expansion abilities of the Sega Master System Mark III, and the 3D artwork was simply astonishing. After the success of the first game, Sega released a sequel but dropped the first-person perspective for a top-down perspective with third-person battles and acted as sort of a bridge and expectation from the Mega System to the Mega Drive. Speaking of the Genesis, Phantasy Star 3 was released on it in 1990, but it was significantly less appealing than the predecessors, and like many series, the third release just couldn't maintain the power of the originals. Since then, it's definitely gone downhill, as Sega slowly started fading from the console market into the developers we know now.
You know, a lot of people don't consider PokéMoN to be an RPG, just because it doesn't follow the traditional format that we as gamers are so used to. But PokéMoN, in its own right, is a role-playing game. There are tons of games which have brought a wide berth of different Pokémon. I mean, I personally only know the first 151 by heart, but the number of active Pokémon now is over 807. Talk about coming a long way. 22 main games in the series have been created, and over 18 different games have been spawned just from this series alone.
Star Ocean. Star Ocean was briefly touched upon, but needs to be talked about because it was a gem during its release. The first game was released in 1996 on the Super Famicom, and while it was successful, it was heavily overshadowed by other series in the genre. The English translation itself was considered less than impressive, averaging mixed reviews at best. The next game in the series is definitely a must-have on the PS1 and follows the same criterion of the previous game, although with more impressive graphics as is expected on the PlayStation 1. There were a lot of unique elements though, for example a skill system that allowed you to do different things such as cooking, writing, and even blacksmithing. Much like its predecessor, it had the mechanic of private interactions, allowing for the player to tilt relations with certain characters. With the release of Star Ocean till the end of time, the series began a slow decline, never regaining the hype of the second game in the series. All in all, 5 games were released in the series, and it's still living, but it didn't sell nearly as much as Star Ocean 2.
Super Mario RPG. This one is odd, like really odd, because it takes a proprietary character from the Nintendo universe and places him on an adventure that was a tad bit different. This game, however, is a home name for people who enjoyed RPGs in the 90s, and with Square leading the helm, it was a unique and different take on the RPG genre with even more unique artwork, as the sprites look significantly different than one would expect from a Square game. The game served as a platform to show that Mario could be more than just a platforming hero, and led to the inspiration of other games such as Paper Mario and the Mario and Luigi games.
The Witcher. As a contemporary series, The Witcher came out in 2007 and was known for having an impressive storyline, some unique combat systems where certain weapon materials affected different monsters, and a protagonist that gets around more than Leisure Suit Larry. You know, if you choose to. I did, sorry, I'm super hormonal as a teenager. But seriously, the game had different fighting styles and different weapons that were different from RPGs in a contemporary setting. Alchemy was also a unique aspect of the series where players could craft different potions and use them during combat and in between battles. Overall, 5 more games would be released, all maintaining the same success as the first installment.
Ultima. The Ultima series was already covered in the beginning of this video, but let's go ahead and talk about them, because the series is the grandfather of all RPGs alongside Wizardry. The first game, Aklabeth, was released in limited quantities in 1979 by the California Pacific Computer Company that was mass released in 1980. Designed by Richard Garriott as a student in high school, the game was originally intended to only be a project and nothing more. Inspired by D&D, Garriott created the game in homage to the pen and paper RPG. When Garriott noticed the success of his game, he decided to continue the legacy of his high school project by creating Ultima 1, the first Age of Darkness in 1980. Oftentimes considered to be the best game on the Apple II computer, it sold 50,000 copies overall, an impressive number for the era. Ultima 2, The Revenge of the Enchantress, was the first game in the series to be made in assembly language as opposed to BASIC, the typical coding language for the Apple II, and featured significantly faster progression through the storyline. According to Garriott, it only took 2 years to code Ultima 2, and the Atari ST port was one of the earliest commercially released games for the Atari ST. The next entry in the series, Ultima 3 Exodus, was the first game of the series to be released on a home console, more specifically the NES and Famicom. 120,000 copies of the game were sold, and Garriott stated that this game in particular was heavily influenced by Wizardry, even though the two series had an ongoing rivalry. 3 would also be the title that Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest would claim inspiration from, leading to the JRPG craze. Ultima 4, Quest of the Avatar, was stated to be the favorite of series creator Richard Garriott at the time of its release, and was a massive game in comparison to its predecessors. The map itself would be 16 times the size of Ultima 3, and the game had unique mechanics which weren't present in previous games, including fast travel and world interactivity, and sales reflected that with 400,000 recorded sales of the game. Additionally, 4 was inducted into the Computer Gaming World Hall of Fame by fans and critics alike. The next entry in the series was released in 1988, during the period where RPGs were slowly fading out. Many believed that 5 was a great game, but some of the combat mechanics were lacking as compared to capabilities of the time. As expected, the series started to decline with the rise of the 90s, as Ultima 6 was considered a dilapidated concept that many people had mixed feelings about, but the game was still successful. Garriott would release 3 more games before finally releasing Ultima 9, Ascension. The game was the first commercially unsuccessful game released in the series, selling only 75,000 copies during its lifetime. This was in part to consumers feeling that the game was rushed and incomplete, and that it failed to cater to a generation that was relatively new to the concept of RPGs. There would be many spin-offs to the series, but the final-ditch effort to keep Ultima alive was the release of the MMORPG Ultima Online, which is still alive and kicking to this day, Wizardry. We already talked about Wizardry because it impacted the market so heavily, so I'm going to keep it a little short. The first game was released by Surtech in 1981 called The Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord. Is kind of an aesthetically non-pleasing, but that was the standard at the time. This standard of gameplay would last quite some time, while Wizardry 2, The Knight of Diamonds featured the same gameplay, and this would also apply to a third game, Legacy of Lilgamen. But this was still hard to distinguish from the other games. In 1987, Surtech would release Wizardry 4, The Return of Wordna, but by then the series had lost its flame. The game unfortunately sold very poorly, and despite the competition from other companies, Surtech was still opting to maintain the same graphical interface that other companies had long dumped for more appealing aesthetics. Surtech, as a company, decided to continue with the system despite the failure of the previous game, and released Wizardry 5, Heart of the Maelstrom, again with incredibly bad sales figures. At this point, Surtech realized it was time to move on from the old system, as gamers were genuinely not interested in the format anymore. The next release would inspire a little more faith in the series, but unfortunately for Surtech, the damage was done. The ghosts of the past releases would haunt them indefinitely, and despite a contemporary and refreshing release by the time Wizardry 7 and 8 came out, their fame would die out. Some hardcore RPG players would still be loyal, but the numbers simply couldn't match the hype for the earlier Wizardry games.
World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft, also called WoW, is an exceptionally well-known MMORPG that encompasses all the lore of the Warcraft universe. For those who are curious, the universe started with the 1994 release of Warcraft: Orcs and Humans. Bear in mind the game is a real-time strategy, so we won't be discussing that portion of the history. Blizzard would make 3 games in this style, each of them having their own expansions. Each of them also were successful in their own right. The game we know and love today started in 2004 with the original release of World of Warcraft, of which many refer to as Vanilla WoW. Since its inception, 6 expansions have been released, each upping the level cap and introducing new classes and raids for consumers to enjoy. More than 100 million accounts have been created over the course of its lifespan.
Ys series. The Ys series was the forefront of JRPGs. It was made by Nihon Famicom in 1987 and was known for its heavy storyline telling plot that was huge to RPG players at the time. It was a massive competitor to the Phantasy Star series, which was leading the pack in RPGs on the Sega Master System. The series saw many releases, many of which were on the TurboGrafx, which boosted sales, but due to the non-popularity of the system, as compared to the competitors, the series was limited in scope to consumers. But they learned their lesson and jumped the series to Super Famicom with the 4th release in the series. All in all, 9 games were released in the main series with 3 spin-offs. The remake, 1 and 2, was met with commercial success as well. However, the series seems to have stalled, with the most recent main series release being a handheld game.
Well, that was it for today's episode. If you like what you saw, please hit that subscribe button and also click on the bell so that you can see whenever I'm releasing new content. Plus, the baby will love you forever. But no, seriously, please give a like and a follow to the people who participated in this video. It was a huge endeavor and I loved making it. It was so much fun. The next episode's going to be with Fatal Framerate and Game Squad, who are going to be talking about ID software, or id software. I don't know how people pronounce it. I'm not an expert. So that being said, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortefyre out.